Well guys, it's that time again for preview time, and honestly, since the last time we've had a new Nintendo game to actually do previews with, it was Princess Peach Showtime back in like March. Everything else has been like remakes or remasters, so it feels kind of strange to be back talking about previews to a new game. But if you guys don't know what this is, pretty much I take everyone's previews of a game, put them all together in one package, and tell you the general consensus and the verdicts of what's going on with the game. And of course, all the previews have went live for The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom. So not only do I have gameplay for you, but I also have tons of new information about the game, so that way you can get a good idea as to what this game is going to be like. Before we get started, I need you guys to stop what you're doing and leave a like and subscribe. You guys got over 350 brand new subscribers coming in yesterday, which is genuinely insane. So let's see how many new subscribers we can get from this one video alone. Thank you guys so much. You guys are awesome. Let's dive into the previews. So for today, we're sticking with reviews from IGN, GameSpot, and Nintendo Life. They seem to have played a good chunk of the game, and it gives me pretty much everything that I need, honestly, to talk with you guys about this game. Above, you're watching gameplay from Nin10doland, actually posted 15 minutes of gameplay from their gameplay session. But let's dive into it. So what is Echoes of Wisdom? Now I'm not going to bore you with the stuff that you already know. You've seen the trailers, you know what this game's about. You play as Zelda, you use Try in order to create echoes of things around the world in order to complete your task. But today, I have some information about what we'll be doing in this game exactly. One thing that I heard is that the overworld seems to be pretty massive. There's a lot to do in it. You'll even have side quests and, a log to keep track of these side quests, and it really feels like Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom with this aspect. Lots of chests to find and places to reach, and it allows you to explore more freely than any other top-down 2D Zelda game ever. As you're seeing on the screen, you can walk on roofs, you can jump on the tops of trees. Literally, she's able to jump, which is something new entirely, but there's so many places that you can go and so many things that you can do within the overworld. It really is pretty open for a top-down linear 2D Zelda experience. Nintendo Life and IGN really dug into the combat, and IGN specifically said that they actually did miss the sword and shield at first, because combat is very, very different. This time around, you'll be spending a lot of time just pulling out other enemies and items such as boulders in order to throw and chuck at enemies, and sometimes it's very overwhelming. Nintendo Life discussed how lots of times, even the easiest of enemies like moblins became a huge struggle until they were actually able to defeat them, which then granted Zelda the ability to have an echo of the moblins. So fighting is going to be more puzzle-based and a lot more difficult than we've ever imagined. I mean, there's even situations, and I've checked across multiple different videos, where yes, it's not an accident, the moblins can climb and get to higher spaces in order to throw things at you. You have to get smart and pretty much outsmart them in order to take them out. So yes, most of this game's difficulty I've heard so far definitely comes from the enemy encounters, just because there's so many different ways to tackle enemies, and especially at the very beginning of the game, which normally is the easiest part, seems like it might be a harder part considering the fact that you have very limited amounts of echoes in order to fight enemies with. So you'll be throwing lots of boulders and probably spawning lots of Zols and other weaker creatures. No one's really talked about this, but just from me watching the gameplay, when you jump into these rift zones, it'll actually take you to the still world. And one thing that we really haven't heard people talk about is that there's a little path that leads you to the dungeon in each still world, which is kind of like the paths that lead you to the dungeon, very similar to Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. So you'll probably do some small platforming challenges in order to get yourself across gaps and reach the actual dungeon in the still world before actually going into the dungeon, which is pretty neat in my opinion. I love the way the still world looks. The colors are all saturated and looks really cool, so I thought that was pretty interesting. First dungeon that everybody was able to play is the Southern Ruins. Now, what I've heard from this dungeon is kind of a mixed bag, but mostly good. If you're a fan of classic Zelda dungeons, this is it, baby. Apparently these dungeons are big, classic, fun dungeons that we've always known and loved, which is really, really cool. They're themed apparently, and also there's lots of rooms with puzzles that you have to solve in order to get keys to access other rooms, and they are linear. I actually heard Nintendo Life claim that that was kind of a negative. Personally, I think a lot of us really wanted that linear dungeon structure back because we're so used to the Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom open-ended structure, but yes, this one seems to be following that traditional scale. But with that in mind, it also has an open nature to it, which means some of the puzzles that you have to solve, they may be linear, meaning you have to go to specific rooms to solve them, but the ways you solve them in those rooms are more open-ended, thanks to the abilities like Bind and Reverse Bond, which actually allows you to move things around and pretty much just act all Tears of the Kingdom Ultra Hand. Now, I've seen seen a lot of people get upset in the comments because, according to GameSpot, this feels exactly like a 2D top-down Tears of the Kingdom game, which is strange. It definitely has elements, but nothing to me really resonated as it looking or playing exactly like Tears of the Kingdom, but as a top-down 2D Zelda, until I came across some comments from Nintendo Life, where they claimed dungeons are kind of easy. Now, this does seem to be the first dungeon in the game, so I am almost positive it gets harder. I mean, it just has to. But apparently, there's lots of ways to cheese certain puzzles, where some puzzles you can just build things in order to get across, throw down some spider webs in order to climb up, which does kind of cheese how the puzzles are done. And I even heard a lot of reviewers claiming that this is going to be something that speedrunners love, which is going to be great for speedrunners, but for us casual players, maybe we want something a little bit more cut and paste, you know, something more linear, like you're supposed to do a very specific task in order to solve a puzzle. I don't know, it comes down to how you love your puzzles in classic Zelda games, but it does seem like they're classic dungeons with classic puzzles, but the way you solve those puzzles can be done in different varying ways. We also got to see 2 boss battles. It seems like mini bosses are returning, in fact, which is really cool. And in fact, the first mini boss is Link, after all. And each reviewer I've seen play this section played it a little bit differently. I've seen some just spawn some Dark Nuts in order to distract Link as more Dark Nuts swung on him from the back. I've seen people using Bind in order to rip the shield out of Link's hand, which made him more offensively powerful instead of defensively. And I've also seen people just spawn the room full of enemies. But after you defeat Link, you actually get his sword, which we already know from the latest trailer turns you into Sword Fighter Zelda for a short period of time as long as you have energy to fill the meter, which is something that I saw used really well with another boss, which seems to be the final boss of this dungeon, being a Talus. Yes, this boss is called the Seismic Talus, and at first I was a little hard on this boss after watching some initial gameplay from Nintendo, where it looked pretty simple, like all Zelda needed to do was spawn a whole bunch of enemies and let them attack the ore underneath him. Well, this is actually a lot different than I thought. Once again, there's different ways to attack this orb. You can throw all these enemies down, including these snakes called ropes, or you can just use Bind in order to grab the orb and rip it away, very similar to the Flux constructs from Tears of the Kingdom, where then you can wail on the orb in your sword fighter form for more damage. And what's awesome is once you get to that phase, it'll actually give you some more energy just for you to use your sword for that section, which is a really cool use. Instead of having to spawn enemies on the weak point, you can actually just hurry up and pull out your sword, which I love. And there's multiple phases of this boss. You can see this phase actually had the orb on his head instead of on his butt. And yeah, once again, just switching to that Sword Fighter Zelda and wailing on that orb was going to be enough to defeat it. My only issues with this is I really hope they utilize other ways to tackle bosses. I'm sure they'll fill the room with certain enemies that you need an echo of if you need to use a specific echo, but I hope it's not all basic things that Zelda has to have in order to defeat a boss. I'm hoping there's different types of enemies and their echoes that need to be used in order to defeat a boss, and the workaround with this is just filling the boss room with those enemies in case you don't have the echo yet for some reason. Or simply having the echo be a mandatory thing somewhere in the dungeon, so you have to have that with you in your arsenal. Or maybe the mini boss has a very specific echo in the dungeon which you definitely need, so after you defeat that mini boss you get that echo which will be used in order to defeat the dungeon's boss. And that way that kind of serves as the mid-dungeon item this time around. Everything that I've heard so far seems to be extremely positive. Like, this game is just such a fun experience for everybody that's played just a little bit so far. But there has been one unanimous problem that I've been seeing over and over again, and it's just making me upset by this time. Like, we are in 2024, almost 2025, and we're still having technical issues. Some people said it was minor. Nintendo Life specifically said it was pretty noticeable a lot. Bouncing between 30 and 60 frames, lots of stuttering and hiccups, and even some of the gameplay, you can kind of see it. It just doesn't look as smooth. Maybe that's just the way the gameplay is rendered for this video. It definitely does look a little shaky to me at times, which is just a shame. It just shows that Nintendo truly needs to give us this Switch 2. They need to announce this thing soon because, man, we are living in a day and age with very powerful consoles, and a game that looks like this, which I believe is a really awesome art style, it should definitely not be causing a game to chug though. This should be an easy game to run at 60 frames, and it still blows my mind Nintendo's having issues with this, and it shows that this is a very old console. It's time to move on, Nintendo. But the last thing I'll leave you guys with is a lot of people, Nintendo Life specifically, saying that this game is just refreshing. And I think that's the word to take away from all the previews, is that this is a refreshing Zelda experience. If you're somebody who's been begging for Nintendo to go back to the classic formula, and you've been waiting for something new with that classic formula, because we know Link's Awakening was a remake, well, you won't have to wait too much longer, because this seems to be a true return to form of the original The Legend of Zelda top-down 2D gameplay, with big, vast dungeons full of unique puzzles to solve, with a little bit of open-endedness to them, and the return of fun, exciting mid-bosses and boss battles at the end of each dungeon. And of course, a sprawling overworld with tons of characters and side quests to complete is more than enough to be excited for Echoes of Wisdom. There's one more thing I do want to talk about real quick after looking at this, is there's been one big complaint that I was seeing from IGN, which is something that I had thought of when I first started seeing these trailers, is the fact of the Echoes list. And it reminds me a lot of Tears of the Kingdom's list of weapons and arrows, where the list was just way too long to fuse things. And when you wanted to look for what you wanted to look for, all you normally had was sort from newest to oldest, or oldest to newest, or most used, and you couldn't just have a favorites list. And there is going to be a long list of Echoes in this game, and IGN has even stated themselves there are a lot of Echoes. Even from the very beginning of the game, it got kind of tedious to scroll through and find what you were looking for. So it seems like the only negatives right now is just the cumbersome menus when it comes to Echoes, and of course the frame rate, which is just, how are we having performance issues? It still bothers me, I'm sorry. But this game looks to be like a blast, and I can't wait to get my hands on it. But let me know what these previews have told you. Is there anything that you're worried about? Are you more excited? Are you less excited? Let me know how you're feeling in the comments down below, and make sure you leave a like and subscribe to stay up to date on all things Echoes of Wisdom and Nintendo in general. And like always, I'll see you all on the next one. See you guys.